Imagine waking up one day and realizing you've been tricked, not by a magician, not by some hacker draining your bank account, but by something far more insidious, the invisible architecture of society itself. Every choice you thought was yours, the career paths that seemed respectable, the dreams you dismissed as unrealistic, the feelings of guilt when you rested, the pride when you overworked. They weren't born from your free will. They were programmed, conditioned, installed so subtly that you call them my values, even though they never came from you. Now pause for a moment. If so much of what drives you was implanted, whose life are you really living? From the first breath you took, you were ushered into a code of rules. No one sat you down to explain them. They didn't need to. Children learn fast, especially when belonging is survival. Cry too loudly and you're told to hush. Question authority and you're labeled difficult. Demand joy over duty and you're shamed as selfish. Bit by bit, you learned which parts of you were acceptable and which parts had to be exiled. That hidden exile, let's call it your forgotten self, didn't just vanish. It lingers like a ghost in the machinery of your life, forever pulling at the levers. But here's the devastating paradox. The very system that told you what success looks like was designed, subtly, invisibly, to keep you from true thriving. You were handed a script and told it was freedom. You memorized your lines and called it identity. Meanwhile, the authors behind the curtain smiled, because a person who performs a script will never improvise their own. Ask yourself, why does the treadmill never end? You get into the good school, then the good job, then the right house, the respectable debt, the pleasing marriage. Each time you tell yourself, once I get there, I'll feel whole. And yet, when you arrive, it's not arrival at all. It's just another beginning of restlessness, of hunger, of subtle despair. Could that emptiness be a flaw in you? Or is it the quiet proof that the game was rigged from the start? Think of how often you felt this quiet suspicion. If I am following the rules so well, why do I still feel so off track? And then, almost immediately, you shoo the thought away. Maybe you tell yourself you're ungrateful. Maybe you drown yourself in work, in distractions, in noise. Why? Because you've been taught that the fault can never lie with society. The fault is always personal. You're not disciplined enough, not motivated enough, not positive enough. Society hands you a broken compass and convinces you the problem is that you can't read it. Isn't that the cruelest trick? The very structure that damages you convinces you to turn the knife inward rather than question the structure itself. So here's the unsettling question. What if the very definition of success you inherited is actually the blueprint of failure? Not accidental failure, not random, deliberate failure. Failure of the soul disguised as external achievement. Society trains you to run toward goals that leave you hollow, because hollow people are easy to control. Exhausted people don't rebel. Distracted people don't ask dangerous questions. Look closer at the patterns. The society that glorifies wealth ensures most people are drowning in debt. The culture that idolizes productivity leaves its citizens burned out to the bone. The world that preaches freedom is constructed on invisible cages of comparison, conformity, and consumption. Do you think this contradiction is by mistake, or is the contradiction itself the design? Imagine for a moment that you could strip away this conditioning. Imagine waking up tomorrow with your eyes suddenly unclouded, not by slogans, not by algorithmic feeds, not by the hush of conformity. What would you actually want? What would you actually refuse? Would you still chase the validation of strangers? Would you still measure worth by digits in a bank, or by how many notifications glow on a screen? Or would you burn the script altogether? Here lies the great question, the question most never dare to ask, because its answer is too disruptive. Are you truly the author of your life, or are you simply acting out the role society wrote for you? If you tug on that thread an inch further, the unease spreads. For if society programmed you to fail, not fail in the public sense, but fail in the private theater of your inner life, then everything you've been taught to trust must be held up to the light. Your education, your religion, your economics, your politics, even your definition of love. What if these are not neutral landscapes, but systems tilted intentionally to keep you compliant, ashamed, and endlessly striving for carrots you were never meant to catch? So here we stand, you, staring into the possibility that your life, despite its triumphs and accolades, has been quietly manipulated toward fragmentation. The restlessness you carry may not be your personal flaw at all, but the signal flare from something inside of you screaming against the rigged contours of society. And the terrifying realization? If you don't face this, the script wins. You'll run until the end of your life, applauded for your performance, while secretly haunted by the suspicion that something essential was missing all along. The stage has been set, the roles have been cast, but perhaps, just perhaps, you were never meant to perform this part. Which brings us to the hidden problem. Why does society program us this way? Where does this conditioning begin? And why has it become so invisible that even our attempts at rebellion often fall neatly inside the same cage? The hidden problem and its psychological philosophical roots. The unsettling truth is this: society doesn't merely influence you, it engineers you. It starts before you even know what choice means. The programming is psychological, philosophical, and cultural all at once, woven so deeply into the fabric of identity that you mistake the cage for the world itself. To understand how society sets you up to fail, you must look not only at external pressures, but also into the history of how humans have been molded into obedient actors on someone else's stage. Let's walk backward, not into conspiracy, but into something quieter, more insidious. The way survival and belonging carved grooves into our species long before skyscrapers and Wi-Fi. The roots of control: belong or die. On the plains of prehistory, belonging wasn't just pleasant, it was survival. To reject the tribe meant vulnerability to predators, hunger, and cold. So humanity evolved a nervous system wired to crave approval and fear rejection. Every scolding gaze from an elder, every frown of disapproval, struck the same chord as a physical threat. Rejection equaled danger. Centuries later, even as we sit beneath fluorescent lights in climate-controlled offices, that same circuitry crackles when a boss criticizes us, or when we scroll past the lives of others displayed as highlight reels online. This evolutionary inheritance is where society digs its claws in. Your very biology makes you primed to obey invisible rules. Whoever controls the flow of approval, parents, teachers, employers, influencers, institutions, controls your nervous system. Society doesn't have to chain you, it only has to withhold belonging. From persona to shadow, Jung steps in. Carl Jung would later call this trade-off the creation of the persona, the carefully crafted social mask that earns acceptance, while everything else, rage, lust, wild adventure, unconventional talent, is shoved into the shadow. This wasn't an accident, but a structural necessity for group cohesion. The shadow is not just the personal unconscious. It is the graveyard of all the impulses society told you to bury. The problem is, corpses don't stay quiet. The shadow leaks back through your compulsions, projections, and crises. So when society claps as you perform correctly, what are they really applauding? The fracture. The version of you is amputated from wholeness. This is where failure is first encoded. The child learns that success and love are available only through self-betrayal. Nietzsche and the manufactured herd. When Friedrich Nietzsche raged against the herd morality, he was not sneering at kindness or community, but at the way collective rules flatten individuality. The herd rewards obedience and mediocrity, and it punishes difference, especially the kind of difference that threatens control. The educational system doesn't want wild thinkers, it wants test takers. Workplaces don't want rebels, they want reliable functionaries. Social culture doesn't want raw authenticity, it wants curated, digestible personas. Nietzsche's warning was simple but devastating. If you amputate your instincts for society's comfort, you may appear civilized, but beneath the surface, you become inwardly hollow. The last man, as he described, is not a villain but a ghost. a safe, obedient being who has lost the fire of becoming something more. Schopenhauer, the will that cannot be contained. Arthur Schopenhauer approached the same puzzle from another angle. To him, human beings were not rational creatures at all, but marionettes of the will to live, that blind, incessant drive pulsing beneath reason. Institutions, then, had no hope of erasing this drive. They could only dress it in clothes, redirect it, manipulate it. This is why modern marketing thrives. It doesn't erase desire, it hooks into it, amplifies it, and sells you a product as if it were salvation. What happens when your raw hunger for life, your spontaneity, your vitality, your rebellion is distorted to serve consumption and productivity? You become both overfed and starving, stuffed with stimulation yet aching with emptiness. Sartre and bad faith, the comfort of the cage. Jean-Paul Sartre saw the same suffocation, but from an existential dimension. Humans, he argued, are free, terrifyingly free. Yet this freedom is unbearable. So what do? We hide from it. We pretend we're trapped in roles, victims of circumstance, bound by, this is just the way it is. Sartre called this mauvaise foi, bad faith. Notice how perfectly this dovetails with social programming. Society hands you roles, student, citizen, worker, consumer, and offers you prefabricated scripts. You cling to them, not because they nourish you, but because they spare you from the dizzying void of freedom. In your heart, you suspect you could write your own story, but the fear of groundlessness pushes you back to the cage. Huxley and the Mask of Progress. Aldous Huxley observed that societies themselves live by masks. Civilizations praise progress, equality, freedom, while underneath lurk oppression and exploitation, shoved conveniently into the collective shadow. Churches preaching love tolerate cruelty. Empires preaching freedom thrive on slavery. Governments upholding justice shelter corruption. Just as the individual represses darkness to wear a persona, entire civilizations do the same. The cost? At scale, the system doesn't just create obedient individuals, it manufactures cultures that rot from denial. What goes unacknowledged festers until it bursts into collapse. Wars, revolutions, cultural implosions, the silent violence of programming. And yet, let's be clear, the most effective part of social programming is not the loud commands, but the whispers, shaping shame and aspiration. You are rarely told outright, don't dream your own dreams. Instead, you are told, that dream is unrealistic. You are rarely told, sacrifice your soul. Instead, you are told, be responsible. Social programming is a velvet cage. It trains obedience with praise as much as with punishment. Think of the millennial who internalizes the command to do what you love, but finds every passion turned into monetized content. Think of the teenager taught to just be yourself, but only within the acceptable parameters of curated self-branding. Think of workers told they are a family at work, while being discarded the moment they become expendable. These contradictions aren't clumsy, they are systemic. They create citizens constantly striving, never arriving. The hidden problem named. Here then is the hidden problem, stripped bare. Society trains you to measure yourself by standards that can never satisfy you, while punishing the very traits and instincts that could liberate you. It applauds the mask, the persona, and punishes the breach, the authenticity, the dangerous refusal to conform. Meanwhile, the buried drives you exiled, the shadow, don't disappear. They haunt every decision, every dissatisfaction, every unnameable hunger. So you become a divided being, outwardly successful yet inwardly fractured, obedient to the script but restless with invisible rebellion, productive but empty, loved on the surface but unseen at the core. And if this seems bleak, it is, by design, because fractured, restless, empty people are easily steered. They consume endlessly, obey quietly, perform reliably, while secretly wondering why the good life feels anything but good. But the fracture cannot be contained forever. The shadow always returns, which raises the next, unavoidable question. What are the unseen consequences of this social programming? What happens when the exile of your true self begins to leak into your choices, your relationships, and even the collective behaviors of entire cultures? The unseen consequences. Stand back and look at your life like a chessboard. Pieces move, strategies unfold, victories and losses leave their marks. At first glance, it seems you're the player making choices. But look closer. Notice how many moves feel strangely automatic, repetitive. Why do you keep burning out when you swear you'll balance better this time? Why do your relationships loop through the same conflicts despite your promises to change? Why does society at large feel like a broken record? Wars repeating, inequality widening, despair spreading in shiny new packaging. That's the shadow of social programming at work, the ghosts of exile slipping through the cracks of our public masks. The problem is never theoretical. It bleeds into actions, rewires desires, plays tricks on perception itself. Projection, the mirror turned outward. Carl Jung pointed to projection as the shadow's cleverest trick. What you reject internally doesn't vanish. It shows up as your judgment of others. Can't face your own envy? Suddenly everyone else is petty, bragging, and undeserving. Can't accept your own hidden aggression? Everyone around you is too hostile. The liar insists others can't be trusted. The insecure leader insists enemies lurk everywhere. Projection isn't just individual. It's the fuel of entire political movements. Propaganda thrives on teaching a culture to project its disowned traits onto an enemy. The violent nation insists its opponent is brutal. The corrupt power paints others as dishonest. Hatred hooks into the unacknowledged shadow, turning internal conflict into an external crusade. Start wars, imprison scapegoats, burn the witches, anything but turn the mirror inward. The erosion of intimacy. Zoom in closer into ordinary love. You want intimacy, closeness, joy. But programming teaches you to hide parts of yourself, to show only the acceptable persona. You bottle your frustration, mute your longing, swallow your shame. Eventually, the mask becomes so tight that when someone tries to love you, you secretly wonder, do they love me or the version I'm performing? Inevitably, repressed shadows sabotage. The anger you swore you didn't feel bursts out as cutting words. The need you hid comes out twisted as manipulation. You cheat, you withdraw, you punish. Not because love itself is broken, but because you cannot bear to be fully seen with all the parts society told you to bury. Intimacy becomes a stage play with costumes and scripts, never quite the raw humanity that connection actually demands. Compulsion and self-sabotage. Then there are compulsions, the ways the shadow slips in when you aren't looking. You promise restraint and end up binging the food, the drink, the show, the scrolling feed. You vow to finish the project, but stall endlessly. You sabotage relationships, careers, opportunities, watching in horror as if some stranger hijacked the wheel. But the stranger is no stranger at all. It's the exiled self, desperate for expression, barging into the scene like an uninvited guest. This is why you sometimes mutter, I don't know why I keep doing this. Because your conscience, the piece society polished, isn't the only captain on deck. The shadow runs parallel scripts, crashing into your carefully curated goals. The collective mask, good vibes only. Widen the lens again to the cultural atmosphere we breathe. Think of the social media mantra, good vibes only. At the surface, harmless, but beneath, it's a collective banishment of negativity. No one must show despair, rage, or contradiction. Everyone must shine, filter, smile. So the negative builds in silence, anxieties ferment, loneliness spikes, depression spreads even among the successful. Restlessness stirs like static under the glossy skin of collective life. What do we call this widespread emptiness? Burnout, anxiety epidemics, quiet quitting, a dawning suspicion that the lifestyles held up as aspirational are strangely unlivable. You sense this not just as a personal flaw, but as a cultural malaise gnawing at millions. That gnawing? It's the shadow whispering en masse. Neuroscience gives it away. Modern neuroscience corroborates what old philosophers suspected. The brain isn't a single ruler, but a parliament of competing drives. Rational choice is thrilled to believe it's president, but beneath it lie primal forces constantly lobbying. When these drives are repressed, They don't disappear. They stage guerrilla campaigns from the subconscious. Every lapse of willpower, every self-destructive spiral, every "what on earth was I thinking?" moment is proof that unseen forces aren't just alive, but running significant portions of your day. And what do you call invisible drives that manipulate your decisions while convincing you the choice was freely yours? A haunting. Except this ghost isn't supernatural. It's programmed into you by family, culture, systems. Success without self. Consider the unsettling stories. The entrepreneur who has everything, but quietly numbs himself with late-night substances. The influencer, showered with attention, yet was drowning in anxiety. The exhausted parent, having sacrificed everything, is still unable to silence the ache that something vital slipped away. These examples aren't anomalies. They are symptoms of success built on a false definition. If the shadow is barred from integration, your victories feel counterfeit. You achieve, yes, but the one celebrating isn't you, it's the mask. So inside you feel ghost-like, as if you've watched your own life from a distance, as if your trophies belong to some other actor who piloted your body while your true self remained gagged behind the curtain. Cultural catastrophes. When shadows unite. History too carries the evidence. Whole civilizations descend into chaos when collective shadows become too strong. Genocides erupt when nations project their repressed fears onto scapegoated groups. Wars ignite from denial masked as a moral crusade. Economic exploitation thrives under the banner of progress. When societies refuse to confront their hidden drives, greed, envy, domination, fear, they leak out in violence, repeating cycles like ancestral trauma on a global scale. The frightening takeaway? The same mechanism that sabotages your private life is written into the story of civilization itself. Ignore the shadow, and its energy mutates into destruction. The exponential cost of denial. The shadow grows stronger the longer it's ignored. What starts as mild envy becomes chronic bitterness. What starts as a mild addiction swells into a life unraveling. What starts as one generation's denial becomes the next generation's inherited trauma. Society trains us to numb, distract, and repress. Yet each layer of repression adds pressure to the subterranean forces waiting to erupt. And so people die with the gnawing suspicion. I lived a life, but was it my life? I succeeded, but by whose standards? I found belonging, but at the price of hiding everything that made me real. That is the final cost of ignoring the shadow. Not just sabotage, not just dissatisfaction, but the quiet tragedy of a half-lived existence. But here's where the tide can turn. Because if denial fuels collapse, honesty fuels liberation. If repression festers, courage heals. Every consequence we've traced doesn't have to be the end of the story, which brings us to a radical possibility, the rebellion. What if you stopped obeying the script? What if you stopped running from the outlaw inside you? What if the very parts of yourself you learned to fear are actually the keys to freedom? The rebellion, how to break free. Imagine the shadow as a prisoner you've locked away in the deepest basement of your psyche. For years you built walls around it. Denial, excuses, busyness, numbing distractions, until you forgot the door even existed. But every so often, you hear muffled knocking, an outburst, a compulsion, an ache in your chest you can't explain. Here's the paradox. This prisoner is you. By chaining it, you chained yourself. By silencing it, you silenced your own tongue. So rebellion begins not outside, but inside. Not by storming the factory gates or smashing the system, though that may follow in its own form, but by daring to turn toward the stranger inside you and say, "I see you." This rebellion, make no mistake, is the most dangerous uprising of all. Dangerous because it demands honesty, and honesty is dynamite. What masks have you worn for decades to keep people's approval? What impulses have you swallowed so long you almost believe they're gone? To admit them might risk everything: the image loved ones hold of you, the reputation you've polished, the illusions on which you've built your identity. But if you will not admit them, you remain a puppet. Step 1. Brutal honesty. Every rebellion begins with a break in silence. To rebel against your programming, you must stop lying to yourself first. When rage erupts, don't tuck it under politeness. Name it. I am angry. When envy slithers in, don't shame it away. Admit, I want what they have. When despair shows up at 2 a.m., don't drown it in noise. Whisper, I am afraid. I feel empty. At first, these confessions feel like betrayals, but betrayal is precisely the point. You're betraying the false loyalties society drilled into you. Loyalty to being nice at the expense of honesty. Loyalty to being productive at the expense of sanity. Loyalty to appearing perfect at the expense of real life. Without honesty, rebellion is impossible. Step 2. Dialogue with the shadow. Carl Jung spoke of active imagination, a method where you allow the shadow to appear to you in some form, a monster, a double, a wounded child, and enter dialogue with it. This can feel absurd at first, like play acting with invisible friends. Yet within moments, you will hear it speak, not as fantasy, but with truths you've avoided for years. It might say, "You buried me when your father called you weak. Ever since then, I've been trying to show you that I am your strength." Or, "You told yourself you weren't creative because you were afraid of failing, but I've been painting in your dreams all this time." By making the shadow a dialogue partner instead of a puppet master, you begin to reclaim its raw energy. Step 3. Transmutation, not indulgence. Rebellion is not indulgence. Society teaches you to fear the shadow precisely by equating acknowledgement with chaos. If you admit you're angry, you'll become violent. If you admit your desire, you'll become depraved. But this is propaganda. To admit is not to surrender, it's to transmute. Unchecked, anger corrodes into cruelty. Faced with honesty, anger becomes clarity and assertiveness. Repressed desire twists into addiction and compulsion. Owned and integrated, desire becomes creativity and drive. The shadow is not a swamp to drown in, it's a river. The same force that can flood your life also irrigates it when directed carefully. Think of fire, destroyer and creator. Deny it, and it consumes everything in secret. Harness it, and it warms, illuminates, sparks transformation. That's integration. Step 4. Dismantling masks in the world. Inner rebellion eventually spills outward. Once you stop lying to yourself, you grow allergic to lying in society's terms. You will quit jobs, end relationships, change habits, not for drama, but because the masks can no longer hold. Expect resistance. The world prefers your obedience. When you refuse to play the part, people will call you reckless, selfish, irresponsible, crazy. Remember, every revolutionary is branded a traitor before they're recognized as a visionary. When you break away from society's script, you threaten those who still cling to it. Their fear will masquerade as judgment. Stand anyway. Step 5. Reclaiming the forbidden gold. Psychology calls this the golden shadow, the radiant parts of yourself buried alongside the dark. Maybe as a child, you loved singing but were told you couldn't make money with that. Maybe you were spontaneous, wide-eyed with wonder, but were scolded to grow up and be responsible. Those exiles live right beside the fury and shame. They too knock on the basement door. Rebellion means not only letting the darkness breathe, but letting the brightness shine. Reclaim vitality, play, imagination, sensuality, laughter, the parts policed by a society that fears anything it can't monetize or domesticate. This is when rebellion stops being purely terrifying and starts becoming exhilarating. History's rebels as mirrors. History remembers its freest souls, not for obedience, but for precisely this inner rebellion. Socrates, who questioned so profoundly that he rattled the very foundation of Athens. Frida Kahlo, who painted the raw truth of her pain, refused the cultural demand for prettiness or modesty. Nelson Mandela, who turned decades of imprisonment into a crucible for forgiveness instead of vengeance. None of them was free because they avoided their shadow. They were free because they met it, wrestled it, shaped it into expression. Their power lay not in denial, but in integration. And in this, they offer you a mirror. Why most don't rebel? If rebellion is the doorway to wholeness, why do so few step through it? Because it costs. Masks feel safer. Self-deception feels easier. The prison feels familiar. You may even feel proud of how well you decorate your cell. To rebel is to step into uncertainty, contradiction, and loss of social approval. That's why most never do. But the irony is sharp. Rebellion feels dangerous, but living as a mask is what actually kills you. Not in a physical sense, but as a slow suffocation of your real self. Better a terrifying leap into freedom than a lifetime of safe imprisonment. The birth of wholeness. The rebellion is not about storming palaces. It's about storming your own interior. It's about refusing the subtle hypnosis of society that tells you you're incomplete, broken, insufficient, unless you chase endless carrots. Instead, you recognize the shadow you feared is your missing wholeness. To rebel is to finally whisper, I am furious and loving, envious and generous, weak and strong, broken and whole. And I belong, not because society approves, but because I refuse to amputate myself anymore. And in that moment, something extraordinary happens. Society loses its grip on you. You are no longer easy to manipulate with shame, with approval, with dangling dreams. You become harder to control, not by becoming destructive or chaotic, but by becoming authentically alive. This is the point of departure. You've cracked the chains, faced the outlaw within, tasted freedom. But beyond rebellion lies something even greater, something almost unthinkable. Once the masks fall, once the shadow is embraced, a final truth waits. The revelation that changes not only how you see yourself, but how you see reality itself. That truth is where we now turn. The ultimate truth, the final, most powerful realization. There comes a moment in this rebellion when something startling happens. At first, the shadow is grotesque, terrifying, ugly, shameful. You approach it like someone walking toward a predator in the night, trembling but determined. Yet as your eyes grow accustomed to its contours, something shifts. The monster doesn't lunge, it sighs. Its face, when you dare to gaze long enough, is your own. And then the unimaginable truth dawns. This thing you feared was never here to destroy you. It was here to complete you. This is the hidden core that society never wants you to realize. The final, most powerful truth. The shadow is not an intruder. It is your unlived life. It is the love you denied, the creativity you suppressed, the rage you disowned, the beauty you dimmed to survive. To reject it is to reject yourself. To integrate it is to become, at last, whole. The half-person illusion. Think of a mosaic shattered into dozens of pieces. If you polish the bright tiles, kindness, civility, discipline, but sweep the darker tiles, anger, lust, ambition, wildness, under the rug, the picture can never form. It remains fragmented, incomplete, a blur of empty space. Society tells you to flaunt the polished pieces and discard the rest, all while whispering that someday fulfillment will arrive. But how can wholeness come from half-truths? To embrace the shadow is to bring back the discarded tiles, to see the image of you in its full spectrum, radiant, not because it's neat and pristine, but because it includes everything. Jung put it bluntly, enlightenment doesn't come from imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, the gifts disguised as curses. Here's the paradox. Within the shadow lie gifts wearing the costumes of curses. Your aggression, left repressed, becomes cruelty. But acknowledged, it becomes courage, the backbone to face injustice and protect what matters. Your envy, left to fester, poisons relationships. But acknowledged, it becomes a compass pointing toward your neglected desires. Your shame, left festering, imprisons you. But faced, it gives rise to deep empathy. Your despair, left hidden, curdles into nihilism. But embraced, it becomes depth, the depth out of which meaning rises. What you thought made you broken is precisely what makes you whole. Descent into the underworld. Look at the mythic stories humanity has carried for centuries. Heroes do not grow by avoiding darkness. They must descend into it. Orpheus enters Hades for his beloved, Dante wandering through hell before finding paradise. Even Christ descended into death before resurrection. Why do cultures repeat this pattern endlessly? Because the deepest transformation requires a descent into what we fear most. Your shadow is your private underworld. To enter it is terrifying, but it is only there that you recover the gold. The golden shadow. Psychology speaks of the golden shadow. Not everything exiled to the unconscious is demonic. Much of it is radiant. Your long-suppressed creativity, your boldness, your ecstatic vitality. All these were buried not because they were bad, but because they were inconvenient to the powers that raised you. These exiles scared authority, challenged norms, threatened conformity, so you locked them away. And when the cellar door finally creaks open, you discover treasures you thought were lost forever. Saying yes to all of life. This is what Nietzsche meant when he urged humanity to say yes, not to half of life, but to all of it. His vision was not of an agonized, fragmented creature, but of the human who dances with existence because nothing, no joy, no sorrow, no cruelty, no creativity is excluded from them. Integration is the act of saying yes without amputating the inconvenient. And Viktor Frankl echoed the same truth. Suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. The pain you bury becomes unbearable precisely because it is meaningless. But when you stitch it into your story, claim it as part of your life's fabric, the suffering is transfigured. The shadow becomes not the site of despair, but the birthplace of meaning, the mirror of compassion. Here lies perhaps the greatest liberation. Once you accept your own shadow, the world's shadows lose their terror. You no longer need to scapegoat. You no longer project demons upon others. You can look cruelty in the eye and see not a demon but a mirror. You can recognize envy, arrogance, lust in others and say, yes, I know those rivers too. This is the birth of compassion, not the shallow compassion of condescension, but the deep compassion of recognition. Once you stop waging war on yourself, you stop demanding sacrifices from others. Shadow integration is not merely personal therapy, it's cultural medicine. Civilization's crossroads. Why does this matter beyond the individual? #meta, pause, sex, 0.05. Because civilizations crumble when they deny their shadows. Wars erupt from collective projection. Oppression festers from denial. Whole cultures become brittle masks until they shatter under the weight of their contradictions. But civilizations can also heal, and the seed of that healing lies with those who dare to face their own darkness. The individual descent becomes the spark of collective integration. Society programs you to fail, but individuals who reclaim their shadows can reprogram society itself. The astonishing final twist. And so, at the core of this entire journey lies a revelation so disarming it feels almost impossible. The shadow you feared has loved you all along. It was never your saboteur, only your neglected twin, an orphaned part of you locked away because others couldn't handle its intensity. All the compulsions, the projections, the outbursts were not betrayals, but cries for recognition. The monster at the door was only the exile waiting for homecoming. The prison guard was the rescuer in disguise, becoming whole. So what happens when you take its hand? You stop living as a ghost. You stop hiding behind the polite masks constructed for approval. You risk being uncomfortably real, frightening to some, luminous to others, but alive in a way that no fragmented self can ever be. Integration does not mean indulging every urge or glorifying darkness. It means weaving light and dark together until you can finally speak with one voice, stand with both feet, live as a whole human being. And then you no longer need approval. You no longer need endless striving. You no longer need permission to breathe. Society no longer programs you because you've reprogrammed yourself. You walk into the world with your shadow at your side like a long-lost companion, and in doing so, you cease to be a ghost. You become real.